Empress Orchid by Anchee Min. Chapter 1. My imperial life began with a smell. A rotten smell that came from my father's coffin. He had been dead for 2 months, and we were still carrying him, trying to reach Peking, his birthplace, for burial. My mother was frustrated. "My husband was the governor of Wuhu," she said to the footman whom we'd hired to bear the coffin. "Yes, madam," the head footman answered humbly. "And we sincerely wish the governor a good journey home." In memory, my father was not a happy man. He had been repeatedly demoted because of his poor performance in the suppression of the Taiping peasant uprisings. Not until later did I learn that my father was not totally to blame. For years, China had been dogged by famine and foreign aggression. Anyone who tried on my father's shoes would understand that carrying out the emperor's order to restore peace in the countryside was impossible. Peasants saw their lives as no better than death. I witnessed my father's struggles and sufferings at a young age. I was born and raised in Anhui, the poorest province in China. We didn't live in poverty, but I was aware that my neighbors had eaten earthworms for dinner and had sold their children to pay off debts. My father's slow journey to hell and my mother's effort to fight it occupied my childhood. Like a long-armed cricket, my mother tried to block a carriage from running over her family. The summer heat baked the path. The coffin was carried in a tilted position because the footmen were of different heights. Mother imagined how uncomfortable my father must be lying inside. We walked in silence and listened to the sound of our broken shoes tapping the dirt. Swarms of flies chased the coffin. Each time a footman paused for a break, the flies covered the lid like a blanket. My mother asked my sister Rong, my brother Kuei Sang, and me to keep the flies away, but we were too exhausted to lift our arms. We had been traveling north along the Grand Canal on foot because we had no money to hire a boat. My feet were covered with blisters. The landscape on both sides of the path was bleak. The water in the canal was low and dirt brown. Beyond it were barren hills which extended mile after mile. There were fewer inns to be seen. The ones that we did come upon were infested with lice. "You'd better pay us," the head footman said to Mother when he heard her complaint that her wallet was near empty. "Or you will have to carry the coffin yourselves, madam." Mother began to sob again and said that her husband didn't deserve this. She gained no sympathy. The next dawn, the footmen abandoned the coffin. Well, there's an opening to a book. Hey friends, it's me, the Ebony Otaku, the well-rounded nerd. So diving back into the world of Empress Orchid, remember we have 2 books we're looking at right now because they connect to the same story. I'll go back and forth in between as it suits me, but we're starting in Empress Orchid by Anchee Min, and then we will be following part of the story in The Last Empress, also by Anchee Min, which follows the same central character as she goes from lowly daughter of disgraced imperial scholar servant to Empress of Imperial China. The beginnings of stories are so important. Otherwise, to quote the narrator of A Christmas Carol, bad English major for getting the title of famous classic literature. But to quote the narrator of A Christmas Story, you have to know all these things, otherwise what follows will not seem as miraculous as it really is. Now, just to level set here, I'm going to call our central female protagonist Orchid for the whole time, or Empress Orchid. Names change as your position in society changes in this time period, and I can't. It's a lot of back and forth, so we're calling her Orchid, central character Orchid, okay? So, as always, we want to understand the world that we are entering as we start to explore new historical fiction. Remember, we only evaluate works within the context in which they're written, and then we try to figure out the lessons that we can learn from that context and the things that are written. As I said in the last video, this is based on Empress Shiji, who incidentally was kind of wiped from Chinese history in some of the most disrespectful ways, like her name being like wiped off the carved tomb where she's buried. Like, what empress? We don't know who you're talking about. Wasn't this China? What China? Different China. But this is a different moment in China's history that we're looking at right now. So when we looked at Lady Tan's Circle of Women, Snowflower and the Secret Fan, Peony in Love, we're going way back. Way back. We're talking medieval times. This story is actually set closer to the world that we know now. It's not too many years in the grand history of how things take place in a nation that's 5,000-6,000 years old. It's closer to the Communist Revolution taking place in China. It's the end of the last great dynasty that's happening, and that would be the Qing dynasty. So that was the last ruling family in China. There have been several over the centuries, but this is the last great imperial family, and they are losing their power. Same thing happened, with the ruling families in Europe. They had all the control for all the time. Every country in Europe at one point had kings, queens, empresses, monarchs, and now it's down to just a handful. Happened in Russia. They had the great line of the czars and czarines for so long, gone. And then there are, the great nations in Africa, and even our indigenous tribes in America and North America and South America. The great dynasties of rulers, for the most part, have died out in favor of either some kind of social rule of government, or in favor of some form of democracy or republic. And most nations have had to go through that transformation in modern times, and a lot of that is attributed to how people make a living changing. So here in the West, we live in a post-industrial society. If you don't know what the Industrial Revolution is, fascinating period in human history, definitely recommend going to study it. But when we say Industrial Revolution, that's when machinery started to take over some of the menial jobs that humans did, or we found better ways to produce and mass produce, as a lot of humans left an agrarian lifestyle and a farming lifestyle to move into cities, and then more of everything had to be available because we had huge populations in single spots. People who live in cities and have not ever not lived in a city don't realize the rest of us don't live like that. if you live in a city like Manila or New York, or or maybe Lagos, when you think of life and space and availability of resources, it's a very different perspective to those who might live either suburban or even in the countryside, where there's more land available per person, where you do have the option to potentially grow some of, if not all, your own food, where you can stretch out in between your neighbors. So it's two very different perspectives of life. And post-industrial revolution, because the world was changing how the population have relation to the ruling class, a lot of countries were left open in ways they had not been before as they went through that change. And when I say left open, I mean to their populations thinking and behaving in ways that simply had not happened historically because there wasn't room for it. We talked about it with Lady Tan's Circle of Women. Confucian China laid out rules for how everyone was supposed to behave in society. You are this, you be this way. You are this, you act this way. You born into this family, you behave in a certain way. These are the expectations. And everyone just kind of went along with it. It worked, the system worketh. But as foreign forces became more prevalent in China, and as subsequent generations of ruling class, of middle class, of peasants began to change how they interacted culturally internally and then externally with the rest of the world, it changed everyone else. What do you mean I don't have to be a peasant? What do you mean I don't have to listen to the emperor? What do you mean there's other ways to live? It introduced ideas that weren't there. That's part of the consequence of foreign influence, be it through conquering, political intrigue, or trade. However it happened, when you have foreign entities entering into a well-established society, it's going to introduce a level of change that perhaps that country wasn't ready for. And unfortunately for China at this time, with so many things happening, especially when it came to the political changes we know have happened in China and what kind of government they have today, when we're reading the story of Orchid, we're also reading the story of how she's had to change, but how her country is changing. These are changes that just would have been unheard of 100 years before, just 100 years, which seems like a long time, but in terms of like humans existing, that's not a long time. That's a blip in the time map. These are concepts of personal freedom, of living for oneself instead of your country. That's not a thing in Imperial China. So what happened? That's why her story is so interesting and why the historical setting is so important to understand. China's on the cusp of revolution. Not quite so much when she's young, but as she gets older, as she goes into imperial life, as she one day has the child who is going to be the next emperor, and he's the last of the line, basically. There's not going to be another emperor after him, although nobody knows that when, she's 10. It's the same thing that's happening with Orchid, that she's going to end up losing things in her life that can never be replaced, and she's going to become someone that would have been unheard of in this society had everything remained at the status quo. How does that happen? I think a good example of seeing how that happens is The Good Earth. If you've not read it, I did a review of that book when I first started my channel. It's fun to go back and look at old videos and see how I've changed things. But when you read The Good Earth, the gentleman and his family who are the main characters in that story, they start off as poor farmers just trying to get along. He legit buys a wife, because that's a thing in that society, because he needs someone to help him on the farm, and he might want to have a son one day, and he can't have a son by himself, and he needs someone who he can come home to and who will make his dinner and wash his clothes. I know, real romantic, right? And that happens, and he eventually gets to a position where he is doing well enough to buy more land and have his own servants working for him. At the same time, there's a rich family who owns most of the land in his area, and everybody rents from them in order to, have farmland to make a living off of. They're all tenants of the ruling family. And over time, the second and third generations of that ruling family sell off the family property, and most of them succumb to opium addiction. If you don't know about the opium wars, that's an interesting thing to study as well. Lots of opinions on that. But they end up selling off, and the poor farmer is eventually able to elevate himself high enough to where not only does he own all the land everywhere, but he takes over the main house where the big family lived. But he eventually succumbs to the same vices that brought down that noble family. And the children he raises, who may have turned out to be completely different people had they been raised in just regular farm life, he now has raised children who are going to do with what he worked for the way that he acquired his additional property. That's what's happening all around China when Orchid is a young girl. Right now, she's only concerned with what's going to happen to her family now that her father has passed. She doesn't know it's the 1850s and that in the 1900s, which are just half a century away, that China's going to be a completely different place. She doesn't realize that there are people right now who are undermining what China has built as an imperium and that it's not going to last. And when it comes crashing down, she's going to be at the center of it, so to speak. And everything that she worked hard to build up is eventually going to be taken away by hands that don't see the value in it the way that she does. But back to the beginning of the book. She's just a little girl right now walking behind her father's coffin. She can look back as a grown woman, which I love it when books are written this way, from the perspective of people thinking back, which is what's happening here with Orchid. You know, my imperial life began with a smell. Her path to going into the palace began when her father passed away. Period, point blank. We've read many times and talked about it, the value of girls in the society, which, yeah, I know on a logical level makes no sense, because who are the sons going to marry and have sons with if there are no girls? I just, where are the sons going to come from? Because, yeah. So, but as a little girl, she doesn't realize all these changes that are happening, other than her family is in a much different position than they were. And her father, although he at once had an elevated position, through many circumstances, when he died, he was not at the height of his career. He was at the bottom. And to be a woman with children whose husband has passed away in this society, unless she had in-laws or a natal home who was overly generous and, you know, would take her in, she's on her own. You want to talk about being up a creek. And this is what creates situations where children who may have had fortunate futures in front of them are now being sold as slaves. They're now being sold into houses of ill repute. They're being sold as farmhands, or boys are being handed over the palace to become eunuchs. That's how it happens. One day we're fortunate, the next day we're not. I got all these extra kids, and society allows me to dispense with them in certain ways. Orchid doesn't know this, but the way that her family will dispense with her will be her going into the palace one day to be a concubine to the emperor. Which on paper sounds like a better deal than the life she may have been destined for, because she could have been sold to a brothel, you know. However, we've talked about this. The imperial brides and concubines are not their own person. Even a wife of, you know, someone who's high ranking would still have far more freedom than an empress, than an imperial concubine. Because the only person they're allowed to have focus on is the emperor. Not even their own children come in front of their relationship to the emperor, even if they never see the man. That, I mean, it is just, it's inconceivable by modern standards. You got to remember, some of these emperors had hundreds, if not thousands, of women in their harem. They didn't see all those women. They didn't talk to all of them. And they certainly didn't make babies with all of them. So what happens to them? Whether you are the empress who runs the harem, or you are the lowest and last concubine, everything they are is about the emperor. And when they walk into those imperial gates, they're not coming back out. There is no visiting your family for holidays. There is no family visiting you. There is no go on vacation unless you just happen to be the favorite of the emperor. But it's not like you get to watch the countryside go by as you're transported. No, you are for the emperor eyes only. So as you travel, you are completely shut in. You aren't allowed to experience anything. And at least as the wife of a doctor, a farmer, a pharmacist, and artist or whatever, there is still some level of experiencing life that would happen. But to enter the imperial gates for a woman is for basically life to stop. You are now in suspended animation, hoping for an opportunity to secure your place by producing the heir to the throne. But you're in competition with how many other women for that? Now, I live in a version of America that I've only ever known it, you know, as a millennial. I've only ever known America as, you know, a place where, you know, when we're doing things right, we all get to be equal and, you know, stuff goes well. That's the America that I know. That's not how it's always been, you know, and there's always improvements to be made, you know, but I don't know this country. I don't have an experience of this country beyond what I grew up with. Orchid doesn't have an experience of her home country beyond what she's grown up with, because you don't know what's happening behind the gates of the palace until you go behind the gates of the palace. Those are secrets that are well kept. She doesn't know how much the world she's in is about to change and how pivotal she's going to be to those changes. The only experience she has is that I was the daughter of someone important, and now I'm halfway to being an orphan. That is a precarious place to be in. As a child, as a female child, as a poor female child in Imperial China pre-revolution. So what do? I don't know how I would have made a life had I been born 100 years ago. I don't know. Sometimes, you know, I sit and speculate, like, what would I have done? What kind of person would I have been? Me, if I had been born a slave, if I had been born with the same personality and same set of traits, that family would have been in trouble. But what if I had been born 50 years from now? Would things be more equitable, or would we have regressed to a different type of society? I don't know. But to have been born on the cusp of incredible change in a nation. Now, there are those of us, me, who are experiencing the benefit of the changes that were wrought. But to be in the middle of those changes happening, that's a completely different type of life experience. I get the life I have because of what other people did. Orchid is the people that did. The people around her are the people that did. She's one of the ones who was there to see everything change. And yeah, change is good. Change should march forward. There is always more and better for society. And maybe it's because I don't have ancestral connection to, you know, where whatever tribe I came from might be. I don't know any of that. But to think to have had it, of what China was, and to experiencing it become something completely different, I wonder how that might have felt. What was she thinking as she saw thousands of years of history change in a few decades, and how that change was brought about? It's an incredible story, which is why I want to dive into it. As always, you know, I'm not going to read the whole book, just the stuff that stands out. Please read the book. This particular novel was published in looking at the cover. When did this come out? I know I paid $24 for this hardback book. I know that. And I paid that in when I was in college. So this has been out for a hot minute. Looking. 2004. Oh, that was an age ago. Still an amazing read that everyone should get into. Other notable books by Anchee Min that I've read, at least. I've read Becoming Madame Mao. Obviously, Empress Orchid and The Last Empress. I have not read Wild Ginger, although I want to. And I think, don't hold me to this because I have to go look at my bookshelf, but I think she wrote The Girl Who Played Go as well. So she's a prolific author. So I would highly recommend. I will let you know, though, some of these novels, not just this one, but some of the others I've read, some of the other authors, learn to enunciate. There are moments in these books where they are being, when I say they, I mean the authors are being very descriptive about certain things. Could be about, how somebody came to the end of their days. Could be about moments of passion. Just letting you know that's in there so that you're not like, oh my goodness, she recommended something that was just I'm just letting you know. This is the nicest way I can say it because the YouTubes being what they are and the algorithm being what it is, that's the nicest way I can say it. And those are not passages that I will be reading aloud. So, all that said, let's continue. Mother sat down on a rock by the road. She had a ring of sores sprouting around her mouth. Rong and Kuei Sang discussed burying our father where he was. I didn't have the heart to leave him in a place without a tree in sight. Although I was not my father's favorite at first, he was disappointed that I, his firstborn, was not a son. He did his best in raising me. It was he who insisted that I learn to read. I had no formal schooling, but I developed enough of a vocabulary to figure out the stories of the Ming and Qing classics. At the age of 5, I thought that being born in the year of the sheep was bad luck. I told my father that my friends in the village said that my birth sign was an inauspicious one. It meant that I would be slaughtered. Father disagreed. The sheep is a most adorable creature, he said. It is a symbol of modesty, harmony, and devotion. He explained that my birth sign was in fact strong. You have a double 10 in the numbers. You were born on the 10th day of the 10th moon, which fell on the 29th of November, 1835. You can't be luckier. Also having doubts regarding my being a sheep, my mother brought in a local astrologer to consult. The astrologer believed that double 10 was too strong, too full, the old hag said, which meant too easily spilled. Your daughter will grow up to be a stubborn sheep, which means a miserable end. The astrologer talked excitedly as white spittle gathered on the corners of her mouth. Even an emperor would avoid 10 in fear of its fullness. Finally, at the suggestion of the astrologer, my parents gave me a name that promised I would bend. This is how I was called Orchid. My mother told me later that orchids had also been the favorite subject of my father's ink paintings. He liked the fact that the plant stood green in all seasons, and its flower was elegant in color, graceful in form, and sweet in scent. My father's name was Hui Chang Yihonala. When I close my eyes, I can see my old man standing in a gray cotton gown. He was slender with Confucian features. It is hard to imagine from his gentle look that his Yihonala ancestors were Manchu bannermen who lived on horseback. Father told me that they were originally from the New Qing people in the state of Manchuria, in northern China, between Mongolia and Korea. The name Yihonala meant that our roots could be traced back to the Yiho tribe of the Nala clan in the 16th century. My ancestors fought shoulder to shoulder with the bannerman leader of Nurhaci, who conquered China in 1644 and became the first emperor of the Qing dynasty. The Qing had now entered its seventh generation. My father inherited the title of Manchu Betterman of the Blue Rank, although the title had given him little but honor. When I was 10 years old, my father became the Tail Tai, or governor, of a small town called Wuhu in the Anhui province. I have fond memories of that time. Although many consider Wuhu to be a terrible place, during the summer months, the temperature stayed above 100 degrees day and night. Other governors hired coolies to fan their children, but my parents couldn't afford one. Each morning, my sheet would be soaked with sweat. "You wet the bed," my brother would tease. Nevertheless, I loved Wuhu as a child. The lake there was part of the great Yangtze River, which drove through China, carving out gorges, shaggy crags, and valleys thick with ferns and grasses. It descended into a bright, broad, richly watered plain where vegetables, rice, and mosquitoes all thrived. It flowed on until it met the East China Sea at Shanghai. Wuhu meant the lake of luxuriant growth of weeds. Our house, the governor's mansion, had a gray ceramic tile roof with figures of gods standing at the four corners of the tilted eaves. Every morning I would walk to the lake and wash my face and brush my hair. My reflection in the water was mirror clear. We drank from and bathed in the river. I played with my siblings and neighbors on the slick backs of buffalo. We did fish and frog jumps. The long, bushy weeds were our favorite hiding places. We snacked on the hearts of sweetwater plants called chow pai. In the afternoon, when the heat became unbearable, I would organize the children to help cool the house. My sister and brother would fill buckets, and I would pull them up to the roof where I poured the water over the tiles. We would go back to the water afterward. Pia! Bamboo rafts floated by. They came down the river like gigantic loose necklaces. My friends and I would hop onto the rafts for rides. We joined the raftmen singing songs. My favorite tune was, "Wuhu is a wonderful place." At sunset, Mother would call us home. Dinner was set on the table in the yard under the trellis, covered with purple wisteria. My mother was raised the Chinese way, although she was a Manchu by blood. According to Mother, after the Manchus conquered China, they discovered that the Chinese system of ruling was more benevolent and efficient, and they fully adopted it. The Manchu emperors learned to speak Mandarin. Emperor Tao Kuang ate with chopsticks. He was an admirer of Peking opera, and he hired Chinese tutors to teach his children. The Manchus also adopted the Chinese way of dressing. The only thing that stayed Manchu was the hairstyle. The emperor had shaved forehead and a rope-like braid of black hair down his back called a qiu. The empress wore her hair with a thin black board fastened on the top of her head, displaying ornaments. My grandparents on my mother's side were brought up in the Cha'an, or Zen religion, a combination of Buddhism and Taoism. My mother was taught the Cha'an concept of happiness, which was to find satisfaction in small things. I was taught to appreciate the fresh air in the morning, the color of leaves turning red in autumn, and the water's smoothness when I soaked my hands in the basin. My mother didn't consider herself educated, but she adored Li Po, a Tang Dynasty poet. Each time she read his poems, she would discover new meanings. She would put down her book and gaze out her window. Her goose-egg-shaped face was stunningly beautiful. Mandarin Chinese was the language I spoke as a child. Once a month, we had a tutor who came to teach us Manchu. I remembered nothing about the classes but being bored. I wouldn't have sat through the lessons if it hadn't been to please my parents. Deep down, I knew that my parents were not serious about having us master Manchu language. It was only for appearance, so my mother could say to her guest, "Oh, my children are taking Manchu." The truth was that Manchu was not useful. It was like a dead river that nobody drank from. I was crazy about Peking operas. Again, it was my mother's influence. She was such an enthusiast that she saved for an entire year so she could hire a local opera troupe for an in-house performance during the Chinese New Year. Each year, the troupe presented a different opera. My mother invited all the neighbors and their children to join us. When I turned 12, the troupe performed Hua Mulan. I fell in love with the woman warrior, Hua Mulan. After the show, I went to the back of the makeshift stage and emptied my wallet to tip the actress, who let me try on her costume. She even taught me the aria, "Goodbye, My Dress." For the rest of the month, people as far as a mile from the lake could hear me singing, "Goodbye, My Dress." My father took pleasure in telling the background of the operas. He loved to show off his knowledge. He reminded us that we were Manchus, the ruling class of China. It is the Manchus who appreciate and promote Chinese art and culture. When the liquor took hold of my father's spirit, he would become more animated. He would line up the children and quiz us on the details of ancient bannerman's system. He wouldn't quit until every child knew how each bannerman was identified by his rank, such as bordered plain, white, yellow, red, and blue. On the day my father brought home, one day my father brought out a scroll map of China. China was like a crown of a hat ringed by countries eager and accustomed to pledging their fealty to the Son of Heaven, the Emperor. Among the countries were Laos, Siam, and Burma to the south, Nepal to the west, Korea, the Ryukyu Islands, and Sulu to the east and southeast, Mongolia and Turkestan to the north and northwest. Years later, when I recalled the scene, I understood why my father showed us the map. The shape of China was soon to change. By the time my father met his fate during the last few years of Emperor Tao Kuang, the peasant revolts had worsened. In the midst of a summer drought, my father didn't come home for months. My mother worried about his safety, for she had heard news from neighboring provinces about angry peasants setting their governor's mansion on fire. My father had been living in his office and trying to control the rebels. One day, an edict arrived. To everyone's shock, the emperor dismissed him. Father came home deeply shamed. He shut himself in the study and refused visitors. Within a year, his health broke down. It didn't take him long to die. Our doctor bills piled up even after his death. My mother sold all of the family possessions, but we still couldn't clear our debts. Yesterday, Mother sold her last item. Her wedding souvenir from my father. A butterfly hairpin made out of green jade. Before leaving us, the footmen carried the coffin to the bank of the Grand Canal so we could see the passing boats, where we might get help. The heat worsened and the air grew still. The smell of decay from the coffin grew stronger. We spent the night under the open sky, tormented by heat and mosquitoes. My siblings and I could hear one another's stomachs rumbling. I woke at dawn and heard the clattering of horses' hooves in the distance. I thought I was dreaming. In no time, a rider appeared in front of me. I felt dizzy with fatigue and hunger. The man dismounted and walked straight toward me. Without saying a word, he presented me with a package tied with ribbon. He said it was from the Tao Tai of the local town. Startled, I ran to my mother, who opened up the package. Inside were 300 tails of silver. The tail tie must be a friend of your father's, my mother cried. With the help of the rider, we hired back our footmen, but our good luck didn't last. A few miles down the canal, we were stopped by a group of men on horses, led by the tail tie himself. A mistake has been made, he said. My rider delivered the tiles to the wrong family. Hearing this, my mother fell to her knees. The tail tie's men took back the tails. Exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed me, and I fell on my father's coffin. The tail tie walked to the coffin and squatted as if studying the grains of wood. He was a stocky man with rough features. A moment later, he turned to me. I expected him to speak, but he didn't. You are not a Chinese, are you? He finally asked. His eyes were on my unbound feet. No, sir, I replied. I am Manchu. How old are you? 15? 17. He nodded. His eyes continued to travel up and down, examining me. The road is filled with bandits, he said. A pretty girl like you should not be walking. But my father needs to go home. My tears ran. The tail tie took my hand and placed the silver towels in my palm. My respect to your father. I never forgot about the tail tie. After I became Empress of China, I sought him out. I made an exception to promote him. I made him a provincial governor, and he was given a handsome pension for the rest of his life. That's how you begin a story. We completely understand who this character is and the type of journey we're about to embark on with Orchid. I love that she lets us know that even this small kindness, following her father's death, she repaid 1,000-fold when she had the ability to do it. Some things to notice that are very different about Orchid from other women of this time period we've talked about. She was allowed some freedom as a child. She played in the streams. She ran up and down with her brothers and sisters. She climbed on top of the roof and poured out buckets of water. She got to go to festivals and see opera. She had friends she played with as a child. Why? She also had unbound feet. She was Manchu. That wasn't something the Manchus did. That's why her unbound feet were something to notice. And something interestingly enough, at this time period that had been happening for a few hundred years at this point, the fashion of sending bound-footed women to the palace had fallen to the wayside. Someone must have figured out at some point that these broken feet were pretty useless. I can't imagine why. But she was pretty. She was the right age, and her feet were unbound. And she's moderately educated. Her fate doesn't have to be the worst fate at this point. But we'll continue in that story another time. I hope you're intrigued enough to continue with me as we follow Orchid's life over the next few not Warhammer book videos. And I hope you will pick up Anchee Min-A's Empress Orchid and give it a read. Pick up The Last Empress and all the other books by Anchee Min, because she is an exceptional author, another one of those whose writing is so fluid, so poetic, so beautiful. She just drops you right into the scene and place and time. You're there. There's no fluff at the beginning. Like, you're in the story. And I absolutely love it. And she tells you exactly who's who, what they're thinking, what their motivations are, and what you're about to get into. So I thoroughly appreciate that in an author. So I hope you enjoyed that. I enjoyed it, and we'll pick it up next time.